The Gospel according to Mark is probably the most misunderstood out of all the Gospel accounts. It was written by Mark, yes, but there's also a lot of evidence which suggests to us that the Apostle Peter had an extensive hand in its creation. We believe, through the early church fathers and their sources, that this Gospel account is actually the collected documentation of Peter's sermons that he would preach while he was in Rome, or even one sermon that he preached while in Rome. And we believe that Mark was acting as his attendant of sorts, making sure everything was written down and perhaps putting the stories in a particular order, arranging them in such a way. And I also believe Mark probably added his own elements, his own added details through his own research and the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. We don't know much about Mark himself. He's a little bit of a mysterious figure when you look at all of the figures of Scripture. But I think the big thing we need to take away from this idea behind the formation of this document is that the Gospel of Mark is a sermon. I think we need to be looking at this Gospel account as if it is a sermon. In fact, if you listen to it, it only takes about 2 hours. You can listen to an audible version of this document, and it only takes about 2 hours. And it's an amazing experience because this sermon is so immaculately put together when you realize how it's been broken down. This is an action-packed story. It goes from one story to the next at a quick pace, and it doesn't slow down very often to look at the teachings of Jesus, for example. That differentiates it from the Gospel of Matthew, which seems primarily focused on Jesus' teachings, not Mark. This document is very much an action-packed story. It shows us the immediacy of the gospel and of Jesus' mission. In fact, that word immediately is used 41 times alone in this document. And that urgency which Jesus is portrayed to have, that urgency is passed along to us because this is a sermon that teaches us about Jesus and reveals him to be the suffering servant as spoken of in Isaiah. This is a sermon, first and foremost, about the suffering servant. And this whole document, the way it's broken down, all of it goes toward that one uniting goal, showing us Jesus as the suffering servant. Now, as I said, this sermon is action-packed. It goes from one account to the next. It doesn't slow down, and neither are we. Let's go ahead and break this book down and zoom in. I want us to notice that this is in many ways the gospel of questions. Many of these sections we're going to look at are asking or posing certain questions about Jesus. Who is Jesus? And then the question is posed, who do you say that I am? Jesus actually asks that question himself. He's constantly asking people different questions. This is the gospel of questions. But let's go ahead and zoom in. We see that it's broken down into 3 acts with 2 interludes. The interludes surround Act 2, and then there's also a prologue. Let's look at the prologue. In the very beginning, Mark introduces his gospel, or you could look at it another way. Peter opens his sermon with a very important statement, found in chapter 1, verse 1, which says, "The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." This is a very important statement, especially a couple of the words or phrases that are used, especially this word gospel. It literally means good news, and it wasn't, contrary to what you might think, it wasn't a word that was unique to the New Testament. This wasn't a word that the Bible made up. This was a word that was used in the Roman world and in the Israelite world. It was used when a king was traveling to visit perhaps a city. They would send a herald ahead who would proclaim the gospel or the good news of the king's arrival. And the idea was that this herald would enter a city and tell the people to prepare for the king. Prepare for the king's arrival. Make his path straight. In other words, clean up the streets. Get a banquet prepared. Make sure that you are giving this king a hearty welcome. The idea is that there's a herald who's going before the king, proclaiming the gospel, the good news of the king's arrival. And this is the idea at the very beginning of Mark that we're given, that Jesus, the king, is arriving. But before he can arrive, there has to be a herald who will then help prepare the way. And that's, of course, John the Baptist. The Gospel of Mark, in the very next couple of verses, shows us that John the Baptist is that herald. As is written in Isaiah the prophet, "Behold, I am sending my messenger before you, who will prepare your way. The voice of one calling out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." Interestingly, Mark is quoting from several Old Testament passages, not just Isaiah. The first part, "Behold, I send my messenger before you," this is from the book of Malachi and also the book of Exodus. Mark then connects this passage of the one crying out in the desert to the passage from Isaiah, which says, "Prepare the way of the Lord." I don't know about you, but in times past, I've misunderstood this quotation. I've looked over it briefly and assumed that this command to make his path straight was given directly to John the Baptist. He is preparing the way after all. But if you look more closely, you realize that this is not the command given to John, but rather this is the command that John is proclaiming to the people. He's telling everyone to prepare for the king's arrival. And this idea fits the Isaiah context perfectly, because in Isaiah, the prophet is telling the people of God to prepare themselves for the coming of Yahweh's presence. In other words, the Gospel of Mark is a proclamation not only of a king's arrival, but of God's arrival. And this idea will continue to develop throughout this Gospel account. But right after that amazing opening where Mark goes back to the Old Testament to point forward to Jesus, we're then shown an amazing story of Jesus' baptism. Jesus is baptized in the water, and a very important thing happens which develops a very important theme in Mark. When Jesus comes up out of the water, the heavens are torn open, and the Spirit of God descends in the form of a dove, and a voice calls down from heaven. And that voice says, "This is my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." This idea that Jesus is the Son of God, that he is deity, this is something that will continue to develop throughout this gospel account. And it starts all right here with this amazing proclamation given by God the Father at the moment of Jesus' baptism. But immediately after this, Jesus starts his ministry. And this is where we get into Act 1. Act 1 is Jesus' ministry in Galilee and its surrounding areas. In fact, you could break down Mark into a travel log of sorts, where the Act 1 is Jesus' ministry in Galilee and its surrounding areas. And then as the gospel continues, we get into Act 2, which is a journey on the road. Everything in Act 2 is on the road, on the way to Jerusalem. And that's where Act 3 really kicks in. Act 3 is when they arrive in Jerusalem. And I think we'll see as we go on this journey with him that the stories in each section are very particularly picked and placed. And so we have his ministry begin in Galilee, and it really begins with a bang. Almost every miracle story in this gospel account can be found in Act 1. There are only a couple of exceptions to that rule, but most miracles take place here at the very beginning. And the idea is that we're being introduced to Jesus as a very powerful, impactful force. And most of these stories you can find in other gospel accounts. But one cursory read, and you'll realize that it's Mark's account which is the most vividly detailed out of them all. If you take pretty much any story that's shared between all four gospel accounts and you compare them side by side, you're going to 99% of the time come away with an understanding that Mark's account has the most detail. For example, it's only in Mark's account that we find out that James and John's nickname was the Sons of Thunder. It's only in Mark's account that we're given certain details about what Jesus was thinking or feeling in a given moment. It's only in Mark's account that when Jesus was asleep during a storm on the Sea of Galilee, it's only in Mark's account that we find out he was asleep on a cushion in the stern of the ship. There's so many little details that are added in, and it really feels like Peter giving his first-hand account. He's showing us what it was like to really be there. Now, Amidst all of these miracle stories, we're shown that Jesus has immense power and authority. And everyone's reacting to Jesus in different ways. And they're all asking the question, who is this guy? Who is he? Jesus will perform a miracle, and people will watch in wonder, and they will think to themselves, who is this guy? And everybody has a different answer. The religious leaders, they say, oh, he's the prince of demons. His own family thinks that he's lost his mind. Even the disciples in this moment aren't sure really who he is. Ironically, amidst all of these miracle stories, the only people who seem to understand who Jesus is are the demons. In these accounts where Jesus is casting out demons, they proclaim out loud, "You are the Son of God." The chapter 3 passage, which is unique to Mark, once again shows this emphasis on Jesus' identity as the Son of God. Now, in this section, there's very little teaching. It doesn't slow down except for one place in chapter 4 where we get a few of the parables of Jesus. Otherwise, it's just giving one story after another. Most of them are miracle stories, and they're showing us Jesus' authority over nature, over demons, over sickness, and over even disabilities. And it's in a section very similar to one found in Matthew that we see one story after another, which just proves Jesus' immense authority, his kingship over everything. He's casting out demons. He's healing the sick. And then he's even calming storms on the Sea of Galilee. And in that moment, when he calms the storm, look at how the disciples react. They say to one another, "Who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him." Who is this man? This question becomes even more perplexing when not long after that we see Jesus raise a little girl from the dead. Jesus is master even over death itself. What power, what immense and awe-inspiring power is on display in this section. And yet Jesus, he isn't doing what most people would do with such power. An everyday Roman, for example, they would use this power to get as much money as they could. And I don't think we're much different. But Jesus, he doesn't demand money. He doesn't demand fame. In fact, he tells people to keep what he's doing hidden. He doesn't want the word to spread too far, too quickly. And yet, try as he might, the crowds and many, many people still follow him. Wherever he goes, he can't be alone. And that's one of the common motifs of Mark, is that crowds are constantly following him wherever he goes. And he's constantly trying to be by himself. Mark, in a very interesting way, I think more than the other gospel accounts, presents Jesus almost as an introvert, as someone who wants to be going off by himself at night or just simply to be by himself and to pray. This is the Jesus we're shown, an intimate version of Jesus that I think comes from Peter himself. But in this section, there is a bit of a shift. At one point, it stops being about what everybody else thinks about Jesus and starts being more about what Jesus' closest followers think of him. And that's where the shift takes place. Suddenly, we're focused on what the disciples, what his apostles are thinking about him. It begins when Jesus sends them out 2 by 2 to preach the word and to even heal and cast out demons themselves. He gives them some of his authority. And they go out and they preach for a time, and then they come back to him. And it's once they come back that Jesus starts involving them in his own miracles. For example, he's in a desolate place with his disciples on one occasion, and crowds of people are surrounding him. And he looks upon them, and he sees that they're like sheep without a shepherd, and so he has compassion on them. And he decides to feed them in the wilderness, very much the same as God fed the Israelites in the wilderness during the whole Exodus story through bread out of heaven. But Jesus, he turns to his disciples and he says, "You feed them." And the disciples respond in confusion. They don't really get it. They're kind of aggravated at Jesus, and yet they decide, okay, we'll listen to what he's saying. And they take what they have, their food, which is only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Jesus says, okay, have the crowd sit down and give this food to them. And so they start passing out pieces of the food. And it's over 5,000 people in attendance. And yet, everyone eats and is satisfied. And the disciples, each one of them comes away with a single basket full of leftovers that they are then left to see God's immense power. Now, it's immediately after this amazing story that Jesus sends his disciples across the Sea of Galilee. And he doesn't go with them. Jesus actually goes up onto the mountainside and he watches them. And he sees that they're making painful headway because the winds are against them. They're having a difficult time crossing the sea. And it's there, as they're crossing in the middle of the night, that Jesus decides to walk by them on the water. And it's only in Mark's account of this story that we're told he meant to pass them by. What does that phrase mean? Does it mean he didn't want them to see him? Actually, it's the opposite. This is a reference back to the book of Exodus once again. There's a moment in the book of Exodus where God passes by Moses. And this idea is repeated later on with Elijah, both on Mount Sinai, where God reveals his glory, at least some of his glory, to Moses and then to Elijah by passing by. This is the phrase that is used. And that's the idea being presented here, that in walking on the water, by passing them by, Jesus is attempting to show them his glory, his deity, the fact that he is God in the flesh. And that's proven also by the book of Job, chapter 9, verse 8, where it says that only God walks on the waves of the sea. Only God treads on the waves of the sea. Only God can walk on water, in other words. And Jesus is doing just that. He's revealing his deity to the disciples in this moment. But they see him and he's covered in shadow and they think he's a spirit. They're terrified. Jesus then calls out to them in this amazing moment. He says, "Take courage, it is I." But the phrase there, as it's usually translated in our English Bibles, "it is I," is actually way more profound than you might think. Because when he says, "it is I," he's using the Greek phrase, "emi ego," which means "I am." And of course, this is a reference back to the name of God given in the book of Exodus to Moses, once again on Mount Sinai. God says, "My name is I am." And in this moment, Jesus is claiming deity by saying, "I am," to the disciples. Now, you may find a lot of people who will tell you that the Gospel of Mark doesn't argue for Jesus' deity. There are some people who say, oh, Mark was written early and it had a less developed theology, and that it's not until John, the Gospel according to John, that Jesus as God in the flesh is really explored or really talked about. But don't believe them when they say that. Because here in this culminating moment of Act 1, Jesus passes by them, walking on the water, and he says to them, "I am." But the disciples don't get it. They just don't understand. Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped. And they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. They didn't understand what was going on because their hearts were hardened. And so it's almost in this moment here, it's kind of a culminating moment of Act 1, that Jesus then goes into round 2, you might say, where he then a lot of the same types of miracles, a lot of the same types of stories are then repeated in this section. And it's almost as if Jesus is saying, you didn't get it the first time, let me try again. And it's in the repetition of these stories that we really start building up to Act 2. Now, it's in the middle of these stories that are building toward Act 2 and the interlude that we see the healing first of a deaf man, and it's a very interesting story. But then we also see the healing of a blind man, and that is what brings us into the first interlude. And there seems to be an emphasis in the Gospel of Mark on the healing of these types of disabilities, of the healing of the blind, of the deaf, of the mute, and of those who are paralyzed. And this seems to be fulfilling the words found in the book of Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, the prophet describes what the coming of the Messiah and his kingdom will look like. And he says in chapter 35, verses 5 and 6, Then the eyes of those who are blind will be opened, and the ears of those who are deaf will be unstopped. Then those who limp will leap like a deer, and the tongue of those who cannot speak will shout for joy. For waters will burst forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. Now it seems that in the book of Mark, just as it does in Isaiah, this blindness and this deafness takes on a spiritual meaning. In other words, we're shown throughout this gospel account people who are spiritually deaf, they don't have ears to hear, and people who are spiritually blind. And I'm not just talking about people who reject Jesus. I'm not just talking about the religious leaders or the Pharisees. I'm talking even about Jesus' closest followers. They were spiritually blind in this moment. In fact, right after the healing of the deaf man and right before the healing of the blind man, Jesus turns to his disciples and he says to them, "Do you still not get it?" And he uses these words from Isaiah, this idea of spiritual blindness and deafness. He says to them, "Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear?" Jesus' own followers are spiritually deaf and blind. And he's going to have to lead them to a greater understanding, even though they're blind. And that's really how we get into Act 2. So Act 2 is bracketed by two different stories, both of them dealing with the healing of a blind man. And these are the only two stories in the Gospel of Mark that deal with the healing of blindness. So it's no accident that they are placed where they are. But they surround a block of stories that all have to deal with the journey to Jerusalem. As I said, all of these stories are on the road, and this phrase in the Greek, this idea of being on the road or on the way, is repeated and emphasized over and over again. In other words, we're meant to view it in such a way that every story that takes place in Act 2 is happening as they're traveling, as they're going on the road to Jerusalem. Now, again, it's bracketed by two stories, and these two stories inform kind of the meaning of this section. So let's go ahead and look at the first one. The first one is found in chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. And I talked about this story a few videos ago. I hope you remember. "And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a man who was blind to Jesus and begged him to touch him. Taking the man who was blind by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting in his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, 'Do you see anything?' And he looked up and said, 'I see people, for I see them like trees walking around.' Then again, he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, 'Do not even enter the village.'" At first glance, this story seems pretty embarrassing for Jesus. It takes 2 tries. His healing doesn't work the first time. Why would this story be in Mark? Why would Mark include that? A lot of scholars have asked that question over the years, and they've used it as an argument to say that Mark was written before Matthew and Luke. In other words, they'll say that Matthew and Luke were using Mark as research and came across this story and thought to themselves, "You know what? This is embarrassing. I'm going to cut it out and not use it." I think that's a very denigrating view of Mark and even a very denigrating view of Jesus. Jesus was God in the flesh, as was just shown to us in Act 1. So he's not making a mistake here. He's not having problems with his miracle. Obviously, there's a point to what's going on. And I mentioned a few videos ago, I promised that I would be explaining what I believe that point is. And so please allow me to do that now. And it all has to do with the context. The context is key. So this miracle event takes place. Jesus heals the blind man, but it takes 2 tries. And then immediately after this, we get into Act 2. And what many would call the culminating moment of the book itself, where Jesus turns to his disciples and asks them a question. People throughout Act 1 have been asking, who is Jesus? Who is this guy? And finally, here at the beginning of Act 2, Jesus asks the question himself. He turns to his apostles and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And the answer that Peter gives is one of the more famous passages in all the Bible. Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, saying, John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he continued questioning them. But who do you say that I am? Peter answered and said to him, You are the Christ. And he warned them to tell no one about him. The answer that Peter gives, you are the Christ, is an amazing, wonderful confession of faith. Peter gets the answer right. He's correct when he says that Jesus is the Christ. But we might be tempted in this moment to pat Peter on the back and then all the disciples and say, good job, they finally get it. But when we look at the context and what happens in the very next story, we realize that they didn't get it fully. In fact, in Matthew's account of this confession of faith, Matthew allows for a little bit of praise on Peter's part, where Jesus actually says, good for you, Peter, on this rock I will build my church. Mark's account leaves that out and goes straight into the next story, in which Jesus, after asking them, who do you say that I am? And after they've given the answer, Jesus then begins teaching them that he is going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to suffer and die on the cross. And in reaction to this very dangerous and scary teaching, Peter actually takes Jesus aside and rebukes him. Peter, a human being, is now rebuking the Son of God. He takes Jesus aside and he says, no, you don't need to be talking like this. What do you mean you're going to die? And Jesus says to him, get behind me, Satan. How did Peter go from making this wonderful confession of faith and fall so far to now he's being called Satan? I think the idea here is that even though he thinks he sees Jesus clearly, even though he knows Jesus is the Messiah, and so do the other apostles, none of them really understand what that means yet. They see Jesus, and they see him to a degree. They know who he is, but in reality, they see him like a tree walking around. And thus we see that this interlude, this very, quote, embarrassing story of this blind man and his healing taking 2 tries, we see that it's actually a real-life parable in action. Because I think in much the same way that this man, he saw people, but they looked like trees, I think the same way that apostles see Jesus. But really, they're just seeing a tree walking around. They see that he's the Messiah, but they can't understand yet that the Messiah would die. They can't understand yet that he is the suffering servant. And so it's on this journey to Jerusalem that we find Act 2 really revolves around. It's on this journey, it's on this road that Jesus then is bringing his apostles to an understanding that he is the suffering servant. 3 times in this section alone, Jesus tells the apostles that he is going to Jerusalem to die. And I think the idea of this journey and him explaining who he is along the way and these 2 blind stories that surround it, all of these are meant to reference back to another passage in the book of Isaiah. I think we're meant to think of the book of Isaiah. In chapter 42 of verse 16, the prophet says, I will lead those who are blind by a way they have not known. In paths they have not known, I will guide them. I will turn darkness into light before them and uneven land into plains. These are the things I will do, and I will not leave them undone. As Jesus goes on this journey to Jerusalem, on the road, he's leading the blind behind him. And by the blind, I mean the disciples. The disciples are spiritually blind. And every story in this section, every story that takes place as they're traveling to Jerusalem, deals with one of these 2 main themes. The idea that, first of all, Jesus is the suffering servant, that he's going to Jerusalem to die, and number 2, that the disciples simply don't understand this. They don't get it. And Jesus is trying to show them slowly. He's bringing them along the way. Slowly, he's showing them that if they're going to truly be one of his followers, if they're going to be a true disciple of him, then they have to be servants also. They have to create in themselves a servant-like attitude. And he says as much in chapter 8, verse 34. He says to them that if anyone wants to follow him, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow him. Jesus is wanting them to understand that if he's the suffering servant, we as his followers are meant to be servants as well. Now, Jesus is taking them on this journey. Now, along the way, he brings them to a mountain. And he takes Peter, James, and John up on the mountain with him. And actually, as he's up there, he transforms before their eyes. It's this amazing moment, the transfiguration, we call it, where his clothes become radiant white, his body lights up. In fact, there two people appear next to him, Moses and Elijah appear beside him, and also a cloud envelops the mountain. All of these images are pointing back to Exodus, pointing back to Mount Sinai, and a cloud envelops them, and a voice comes out of the cloud, much the same way that we started off the book with a voice from heaven. Now the voice comes back, God the Father speaks, and once again he says that Jesus is his beloved Son. He says, "This is my beloved Son." But instead of saying, "With you I am well pleased," he adds something new to the discussion. He says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." I think that's a really cool moment that throughout this journey, the disciples are having a really difficult time understanding what Jesus is saying. And now God the Father is saying to them, just listen to him. Because he's been taking them along this journey, but they just haven't gotten it. They just haven't understood. Well, this section, this journey ends in chapter 10. And in a very important way, we find in chapter 10, verses 42 through 45. Calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles domineer over them, and their people in high position exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. Rather, whoever wants to become prominent among you shall be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This section, this journey to Jerusalem ends with this profound statement where Jesus says, "I, God in the flesh, the Son of Man, the Son of God, the Son of David, the Messiah, I didn't come to be served, but to serve." That's a profound, amazing moment. And you know what? Jesus didn't just say that, he put it into action. And that's really what leads us into the second interlude. The second story of a blind man being healed is another parable in action. It's another parable which shows us Jesus' words that he put his money where his mouth was, frankly speaking. There's a moment where they're walking by Jericho, and a blind man is there by the name of Bartimaeus. And this blind man hears that Jesus is nearby and starts calling out to him. And all the people around him say, "Oh, shh, be quiet." They're saying, "He doesn't want anything to do with you. He's too important for you. So stop talking." And yet Jesus, he hears him. Of course, he knows he's there. And Jesus calls the blind man to him. And so Bartimaeus goes to Jesus and falls down before him. And Jesus says a very profound thing to him. He says, "What can I do for you?" In other words, he's saying, "How may I serve you?" Jesus, the Son of God, the one who has just only a few chapters ago claimed to be God himself, "I am." Here he is saying, "How can I serve you?" to a blind man. Because he came to this earth to be a suffering servant. He didn't come to be served, to be given lavish, goods and riches and majesty. He came to serve, and that's exactly what he did. And so we see this section ends after this interlude in the climax of the Gospel of Mark. And that's when they finally arrive in Jerusalem. And they arrive to find that the people are not prepared. At the very beginning of the Gospel, we were told that the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, there's a herald proclaiming the good news. John the Baptist came saying, "Prepare yourselves for the King's arrival." Well, now the King has finally arrived in the city. He's made it to Jerusalem. In the triumphal entry, we see himself as a king being presented. And yet the people are not ready. They've rejected John the Baptist, the herald. And now they have made the temple into a place of robbery, of theft. And Jesus goes in with judgment. He cleanses the temple. He kicks people out of it. And he begins having conflicts with the religious leaders in the temple courts. Jesus is bringing judgment upon them because they weren't ready for the king's return, for the king's arrival. And then we see, even though there's not very many details at the end of Mark that are unique to Mark, we see that all of the themes that have been built up in the previous chapters are coming to a head with the passion story of Jesus, where Jesus is arrested in the garden. And Mark does add an interesting little anecdote, somewhat amusing, you might say, where a man who happened to be following with them was wearing nothing and yet had wrapped himself in a linen sheet. And we find out that when Jesus was arrested, they pulled the sheet off of him and he ran away naked. It's kind of an amusing story, once again showing us what it was like to be there. It feels a little bit like Peter sprinkling in his own details. But again, there's not very many details in this account, at the end of the account, that are unique to Mark. But we see that in Jesus' arrest, in his trial, that Jesus is fulfilling everything he's warned them about in the journey leading up to this moment. And so Jesus is arrested and he's taken before the council of the Jews and the Sanhedrin. And they begin asking him questions. And then the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, "Do you not offer any answer for what these men are testifying against you?" But he kept silent and did not offer any answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and said to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Jesus once again uses that phrase, "I am." And in this moment, he's being questioned. They ask him, "Are you the Son of the Most High? Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And they understand what that means. They know he's claiming deity, and that's why they want to kill him. And so they send him off to the Romans. He's mocked. He's beaten. He suffers for us. He's put in a purple robe. He's spat on. They just slap him in the face. They do all sorts of horrible things. There's an emphasis in Mark's account, there seems to be, on the humiliation factor of the passion. Where as Jesus suffers, people are just hurling insults at him from all sides. His own followers have deserted him. One of his own followers betrayed him. Peter has denied him. And now Jesus is going to Golgotha alone. He's brought to the Mount of the Skull, and he is crucified. And it is there in that moment that he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was pierced for our iniquities. And we see this amazing moment, this tragic moment, yes, but it's also an amazing moment, the cross. The suffering of Jesus, it's all built to this moment where he dies. And throughout the other gospel accounts, we find out that there were many different miracles that took place at the moment of Jesus' death. We know that darkness came over the whole land while Jesus was on the cross. And that is mentioned in Mark's account. We also find out that at the moment of Jesus' death, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. We also find out that there was an earthquake and that dead people actually rose from the grave and began appearing to people. And when you view these miracles and when you consider the context of these miracles, we look at the centurion and we think, oh, well, no wonder he thought that Jesus was the Son of God. But Mark's account leaves most of those miracles out. Mark's account adds in the darkness and also the veil of the temple. But it doesn't seem that the centurion who's there guarding Jesus' execution would have actually witnessed the tearing of the temple veil. So what's my point? My point is that we don't know exactly why the centurion came to faith that Jesus was truly the Son of God. Well, Mark's account presents it in such a way that it is Jesus' suffering that leads him to that conclusion. It's Jesus' death. It says, when he saw Jesus die in this way, he proclaimed, surely this was the Son of God. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a Roman person sitting in the audience as Peter gives this sermon, or as this gospel account is read aloud to you. And because you're a Roman, you are prone to liking certain things. You like powerful demigods. You like the Greek mythology stories of warriors. And so when Jesus was presented to you at the beginning of this story, you liked him because he was shown to be powerful. He was shown to be a mighty warrior, an unstoppable force. But then you were taken on this journey where Jesus is telling you to wrestle with a few difficult things because you just can't understand why a son of the gods would die, would suffer, or be a servant. That just doesn't make sense to you. But then you're shown in the moment of the cross just how powerful that act of service really is. Or maybe you're a Jewish person in the audience. The Jewish people at that time were scattered abroad. There were many Jews who could have been there in Peter's audience. And maybe you know the scriptures of old. You know Isaiah where it speaks of the suffering servant. And yet you still had your own preconceived ideas as to what the Messiah should look like. You don't understand how the Messiah, the Christ, could suffer and die. And so you were taken on this journey as well. You were taken along the road where you had to wrestle with some difficult ideas. And then you see the moment of the cross. And you realize, just as the Roman realized, that this moment was profoundly powerful. That there is glory in the suffering of the cross. A profound glory. In the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we're told that the word of the cross was considered foolishness by the Gentiles and was considered a stumbling block to the Jews. The Jews couldn't understand how the Messiah would die. That didn't fit their preconceived notions or ideas. And in the same way, the Romans had their ideas of the gods, their ideas of deity, did not match the idea of a suffering servant. And so the word of the cross seemed foolish to one and a stumbling block to the other. But the Gospel of Mark takes both of these audiences and takes us as well on this journey so that we can realize for ourselves that even though the cross doesn't fit the stereotypical idea as to what might is or what it means to be mighty, there is nothing more mighty than what Jesus did for us on the cross, because he took our sins upon his shoulders and he suffered and he died in our place. Jesus, his suffering, his death is the saving moment of history. And the Gospel of Mark has brought us to a point where we can accept that. Now look at how the Gospel of Mark ends. It ends in a very strange way, almost an anticlimactic way. Because in most of the manuscripts that we have, most of the earliest manuscripts that we have, it ends with two women going to the tomb and finding that it's empty. The stone has been rolled aside and an angel is there who speaks to them. The angel said to them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See, here is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. According to most of our early manuscripts, this is how the Gospel of Mark ends. Almost an anticlimactic ending. It ends with a question mark, where these two women are struck by terror and fear, and we're not told what they did next. And I think that's purposeful. Obviously, it's purposeful, where we're meant to ask ourselves, what would we do with the information? This sermon is ending, as all good sermons do, with an invitation or an altar call, so to speak, where we're shown these two women who are told to go spread the news, and yet we're left wondering, did they? It's a big question mark. And in the same way, we're asking ourselves as we listen to the sermon, am I going to do it? Am I going to spread the message? Am I going to follow Jesus even though it's scary, even though it's difficult, even though I'm trembling with fear? Now you might ask, what about this epilogue? And I put a question mark there because it's only some of the later manuscripts that have this. Most scholars would call this a later edition. But that doesn't mean it isn't inspired. In fact, I like the theory that Mark added this to Peter's sermon after the fact, perhaps after Peter died. But it's this interesting little addition to the end of the book that gives us a brief overview of some of the things that the resurrected Jesus did. And then it ends with Jesus giving an amazing declaration, an order, a command for all of us to follow. And in this way, if you include the epilogue, it takes the ending of Mark, which is more of a question mark, and turns it into an exclamation point. And that's really what this does. In Mark chapter 16 and verse 15, Jesus says, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. The one who has believed and has been baptized will be saved, but the one who has not believed will be condemned." The Gospel of Mark, this amazing action-packed sermon, ends in such a way that we are left with a call to action. And really, this is what this sermon is all about. Yes, it is a sermon that shows us that Jesus is the Son of God. It is a sermon that shows us that Jesus is the suffering servant of Isaiah and our only hope. But perhaps above all, the Gospel of Mark is a call to action.